For some time, the gaffe that keeps on giving, Joe Biden refused to talk about guns all that publicly, especially around the time of his humiliating debate. And for a while, I was wondering why this would be the case. Why would a president who is so vocal about his opinions be so quiet about a subject that he claims to be passionate about? Is he not the most powerful man in the world? And I believed for a while that he was being quiet on the subject because of some sort of kind of PTSD-like post-trauma of the backlash that he received both as the vice president under Obama in the 2012-2013 timeframe, as well as in that run-up to his first election as president. Where he would constantly and repeatedly make these claims about AR-14s and drone striking American citizens. So the silence on the subject at first was not all that surprising, but now that he has metaphorically passed the baton on to Harris, we're starting to see a old beast rise again. And so the title of today's episode might be a little bit clickbaity, but trust me on this one, it's a part of an experiment, and also the show will continue on as scheduled. But there's an important statement, and I think Shadzi over on X said it best, where he made the statement, "When people tell you who they are, you best believe them." And that comment was in reference to a clip where Kamala Harris apparently does not believe that you have a right to privacy.
Just because you legally possess a gun in the sanctity of your locked home doesn't mean that we're not going to walk into that home and check to see if you're being responsible and safe in the way you conduct your affairs.
So the key line is, just because you own a firearm in the sanctity of your own home doesn't mean that we aren't going to walk in and confirm, paraphrasing, that you are storing it properly. This argument is, again, a form of rhetoric. It's a kind of conversation that reveals quite a bit more about what we believe about what is right and true and good. Much more than the ownership of firearms itself. See, private property has two words. There is the privacy element of it and the possession, the property element of it. And so while I've talked about this subject before, I think that the idea of private property really is the perfect or ideal fusion of the abstract with the physical. It binds what we consider objects like firearms and suppressors to our world, but also the fact that it also illustrates that we are more than mere biology, that we are individuals with perhaps a mind, a soul, and a spirit. The idea that we could have this concept of private property implies identity and ownership and so on and so forth. So, before we go much further down this road, this episode is sponsored by Obsidian Arms. And while they do represent many of the different facets of gun culture, something that you've heard me said before, they also offer a series of services for you if you are looking to bring products to the market. If you're trying to design, develop, or you have a design already put together and you need to have it manufactured at scale, then give Obsidian Arms a check at obsidianarms.com. But on the other side, if you're interested in self-sufficiency, check out their toolkits, which come with a lifetime warranty, and some of their parts that have features that set them apart within the market. I'm being vague on purpose, most likely for the YouTube censors. That being the case, again, head over to Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com and thank them for sponsoring this show. So back to the topic. The reason why I phrase this as something that is more dangerous than gun control itself is a bit of a misnomer. It's not that it's not really about something that's more dangerous per se or worse than gun control. It's that I want to address the beating heart at the center of this idea that we keep seeing come back to life again and again and again. Communism or ideas like this are kind of like a reoccurring nightmare. They might lay dormant for a generation or a couple of decades, but they always come back. This idea of the tyrant or the this idea of the tyrant, or the abolition of man, not to overly reference C.S. Lewis, is something that is going to continue throughout history. As we can look backwards, we see that it rises and falls and rises and falls. We should expect, in all intent and purposes, that it will continue going forward. And the idea of the Second Amendment is the thing that I believe is important here. It's in fact what we've based this show on. Kamala Harris's statement on individuals owning a firearm in the sanctity of their home not also being as if that was endorsement is kind of this flip-flop that she does frequently, but her statement really struck at the core identity of what the Redacted Culture Cast is about, because it's not really the Second Amendment that I care about so deeply. It's not that which I think is important. Rather, it's the ideas and it's the substructure upon which the Second Amendment is built upon that I think is much more important. If you wanted to look at this in utilitarian terms, it doesn't really matter if we have the Second Amendment enshrined in our Constitution if the people who enforce the laws and the people who live in our society don't really believe it, if they live as if it is not true. And so it doesn't matter whether you call yourself a law enforcement agency or a violence prevention organization or whatever. None of these things really matter if you are doing the opposite of what you claim to be. This is that double-sided speak that is so prevalent in our society, where someone will create an organization or they will title themselves as something. I am this is the organization of gun violence prevention, and meanwhile all they're doing is sending jackboot thugs to beat up people and take their private possessions. You're not really the gun violence prevention, you're just the monopoly of violence organization. And so what we see here, in what we're going to see and what we're going to cover today, is a recent statement by the, comically stated, Biden and Harris White House about some upcoming events. So we're going to look at this statement by the White House, and we're going to compare it to the issues that we're talking about here with the concept of privacy being just as important as property. And then we'll come back at the end and I'll explain why I think privacy and the protection of privacy itself is a more effective weapon at countering tyranny, or at least it is the one vital ingredient amongst two, the privacy and the property, in order to prevent tyranny itself. So this statement by the Biden and Harris White House begins with it follows a certain pattern. You have a statement at the top. Today, President Biden and Vice President Harris are announcing a new executive order directing federal agencies to improve school-based active shooter drills and combat the emerging threats of machine gun conversion devices and unserialized 3D printed firearms, as well as additional executive actions that advance the Biden-Harris administration's agenda to reduce gun violence and save lives. I want to break it down early and start at the format of the argument. What happens in the presentation of this statement, which you can find at the whitehouse.gov website, is that it starts with sort of a series of accusations, which is where we are going to have to begin. And those accusations are a justification for what's about to come. And then it states two emerging problems. One of them being that there is is that you're getting these Glock switches is not the word that they're going to use, but they're going to use machine gun conversion devices, and they're concerned about the proliferation and distribution of machine gun conversion devices, as well as the unserialized 3D printed firearms. And so this is sort of in a structure. This is the urgency and the issue that needs to be solved. So they state that there is a problem. They characterize the problem as being the responsibility of certain individuals. They claim that the problem that they're trying to address with this action is machine gun conversion devices and unserialized 3D printed firearms, and then they provide their solutions. And the spoiler alert is that the solutions don't really have much to do with the problem. They really have they really, perhaps even accidentally show their hand in the opening where they say, as well, quote, as well as additional executive actions that advance the Biden-Harris administration's agenda to reduce gun violence and save lives. We have a problem over here, give you a sense of urgency, then use our support from the sense of emergency to produce, or to continue to produce our quote agenda. So let's get into it. The reason why I begin also with the issue of doublespeak is because it continues rather rampantly here, and you don't need to look much more further than the next couple paragraphs. So right after the opening paragraph, we have the opening to, well, their urgency. And this is going to be a loose but direct quote. After the prior administration oversaw the largest one-year increase in murders ever recorded, President Biden and Vice President Harris took action from the start of their administration to reduce violent crime. This is a very, very important statement because it claims that the prior administration, the Trump administration, oversaw the largest one-year increase in murders ever recorded. It was you doing the murder. This is why it is so interesting to look at what's going on here. President Biden and particularly Vice President Harris, if you recall the good old year of 2020, the summer of love, Vice President Harris fundraised in order to pay for the release of people who participated in violence, especially in Minnesota. I was there watching people. I was there. I remember coming up to a small store amidst the riots and the looting, seeing three men with AKMs or AK-47s, for those who are not as familiar, standing outside their shop, just trying to protect it from being looted. Those people would be under more threat than the people who were participating in the looting. So we have to go back to this. After the prior administration oversaw the largest one-year increase in murders ever recorded, that was you, that was your party, you funded it, you supported it, you campaigned off of it. So this is how that doublespeak works. The very people who burned down your local grocery store are now claiming that it was somebody else who did it, particularly their political opponent. It's an interesting strategy, but it's not an unusual one. We're going to see this problem recreate itself over and over and over again through this statement. And we're going to move on to the next one. Under the leadership, this is the next paragraph. Under the leadership of President Biden and Vice President Harris, in 2023, the United States experienced the single largest homicide rate drop in recent history. This is another important data point. Data point one. The riots and the violence that went on, that started in 2020, under the influence and motivation of the very people who are accusing you, the gun owner, of doing crime, while they supported it and encouraged it, that riots and violence continued well into 2020, 2021, and in some places into 2022. So the dramatic decrease in homicide also has another problem with it. How many of those homicides were simply just unreported? This problem is starting to emerge. It's starting to be presented across media, social media. Different reporting agencies are looking at how, no, the crime isn't actually down. People just aren't reporting it anymore. That could mean two things. It could mean that the statement of the White House is actually true, that the actions of the Biden administration the Biden and Harris administration was successful at curbing violence in America. It also might mean option two. People got tired of it, and the motivation and energy from the summer of love essentially ran out, and the spike or the drop that they're claiming is their responsibility is simply the fatigue of the population. Or three, that the population of the United States no longer has confidence in the law enforcement system that they live under, and so continue to no longer, or are reducing the amount of reporting that they're doing. To be more clear on that, 3 possible arguments that come out of here. 1, that the actions of the president and vice president were successful at reducing violent crime. 2, that reduction in homicide is actually just the fatigue of the society after 2, maybe 2.5-ish years of rather distinct violence. And then 3, it may actually just be the case that the people, the population, are not reporting anymore about what they encounter. Rather, since they don't trust that the law enforcement agencies are actually serving them, they simply just keep to themselves. And so already right off the rip, at the beginning of this article this statement by the president and the vice president, this announcement of additional actions to reduce gun violence, from the beginning, it is dubious. From the beginning, it is dubious, it's very similar to a type of book that I've read multiple versions of, where the opening chapter is an impassioned representation of some sort of recent political event. Maybe it would be January 6th, or maybe it would be the FBI plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, whatever. And then the rest of the book is using the urgency from this sort of dubious explanation of an action as justification for all of the further action. Let's just look at one Malcolm Nance. But what this produces is the continuation of the argument as the article or as this statement goes on. So we have to move on to what is the problem. Let's make one more comment before this. So the statement by the White House is being specifically identified as both President Biden and Vice President Harris. And Vice President Harris in recent weeks has had to flip-flop back and forth about certain topics, particularly anything related to gun ownership. She makes a statement that you can't. Over here, she says in this argument that no, you don't have a right, or you do have a right, or we have a right to invade your privacy and look at your home. She owns a gun. She would shoot somebody if they invaded them. Again, it smacks very ugly of rules for thee, but not for me, or I can do what I want, but you can't do anything about it. And it just kind of gets ugly over and over and over again. And not only but I think there's a certain element of this statement by the White House that is trying to give Kamala Harris some of the tour de force of the president that she was attached to, of whatever is left of the Biden legacy. Now, that is then going to get passed on from her into Walz, and now we want to look at the firearms law and firearms law and positions of both Harris and Walz herself. Perhaps Biden, in the last of his salient years, was savvy enough to avoid certain topics as best as he could and just ultimately got trapped. It doesn't appear that Kamala Harris is capable of making that distinction. In addition to that, though, not only did she pay for the violence that she is accusing her predecessor, or she is accusing the Trump administration for allowing, she was also condemning the enforcement against said action. She was saying, we're going to burn down your town, I'm going to fund it, and if you stop it, you're a bad guy. But now that you didn't stop it, 4 years later, you're the bad guy for not doing what we told you not to. This kind of never-ending loop. Short answer, never trust somebody who's already intent on doing you wrong. But then there's the question of Walz. Now, Walz oversaw Minneapolis as its governor, Minnesota as its governor during the time of the riots. And there are now more and more dubious reports of what he actually did during that institution. In the presidential race that we're looking at right now, I think that I would describe Kamala Harris as the front runner, the face, the distraction, and you could even call her the flashbang, I guess, but Kamala Harris as the flashbang and Walz as the hammer that's going to smash the kneecaps out from underneath his opponents. Kamala Harris distracts, where Walz will go in and make aggressive movements against various individuals. We saw this during the Summer of Love when he would particularly and say enforce certain rules against certain people, but not against others. You could protest, you could have thousands or tens of thousands of people in the streets doing whatever you want, but God forbid you go to church. You could burn down a Wendy's, but you couldn't open your business unless, of course, you were a Fortune 500 big box store. You could report your neighbor in a Gestapo-like fashion from a state-sanctioned organization. And there was even a concern where private organizations were allowing users, or private like websites were allowing users to flag locations as not being in support of the movement. This was the hellscape that Walz was part responsible for crafting, or at least he was responsible for overseeing. That's enough of that level of politics for now. So moving into the upcoming events, what comes out of this? The two emerging threats that the White House talks about are machine gun conversion devices and unserialized 3D printed firearms. These are intriguing, quote, emerging firearm threats to address because quite a bit of America has become aware of them, either comically or tragically in recent years. Grantham himself did a video of a Glock with the switch, or whatever the phrase is now, and it seems like there are two different types of people who are engaging in these activities. The machine gun conversion devices are an interesting problem because we have a series of laws in the United States that prevent the manufacture of machine guns, or prohibit the manufacture of machine guns by unlicensed, registered, blah, 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 blah. So, you know that there's a series of jokes about drilling the third hole in an AR-15 or whatever, and we all know that it's kind of a joke, but it's a little spicy. So on the one hand, while the, quote, gun culture makes jokes about a fully automatic firearm, and they kind of keep it a little bit in, not necessarily the taboo, but the sort of inside jokish realm, there's an entire another group of people that are really not part of the gun culture that are buying, acquiring, or being given these items. So a machine gun conversion device, if we're talking about the switch for the Glock, is not really what you would expect to find in the home of an average American gun owner. I mean, the most things that you might find that's close to a conversion device is maybe a rubber band, I guess, if you want to follow that route. But what you're going to find, if you go to parts of the inner city, you'll see little gangs of kids running around with fully automatic, possibly 3D printed Glocks. And now you can't 3D print every component of a firearm, and there are some issues here. But the question remains of if we're addressing the problem in Group A or Group B, we'll call the people who are somehow acquiring the Glock with the switch, and if we're gonna identify them as Group A, and then Group B is your average American gun owner, gun culture individual, why is Group B, the gun culture, being potentially punished for the actions of people that they're neither affiliated with nor do they interact with in any meaningful way? This is a continual and common strategy that we see, especially in the field of gun control, and why I'm returning to the problem of privacy at the beginning here, in how by creating a problem and festering a wound within a population, now we have a sense of urgency, which justifies an increase of power. That increase of power then is used to punish political opponents. I'm gonna take an intermission here, and then we're gonna come back into it. So this brief intermission is what I believe the intent was behind the Brace ruling. See, there was this grandiose explanation and something that we're going to see in the for the language of the quote unquote solutions for this White House statement. But what I think the original Brace ruling was intended to do was not to curb the use of a certain type of firearm in violent encounters, nor was I think it had any intent to address crime or criminality itself. Rather, it was either to demoralize or economically bankrupt political opponents. This is, or maybe even a political class, let's call it. I believe that the intent of, if I were to make some speculations, I believe that the intent of the Brace ruling was to financially damage the average American who would buy something like an AR-15. Its intent was to economically damage the gun culture and the firearms industry. Now, this might sound a little bit like internalizing a problem that might not have been directed at myself, but allow me to explain. At the time of the release of the announcement of this new ruling that is now by the time of recording is no longer in effect, there was very, very little examples or evidence that a pistol stabilized with a brace was being used in any sort of meaningful crime. There might be a couple of events. In fact, you could make the old statement of, if you can name all the times it was used, it's not an epidemic, or whatever the word is of the day. And so what ended up happening, though, is now the firearms manufacturers, the companies like Daniel Defense or Maxim Defense or whatever or all these other companies that were selling firearms, particularly AR pistols with braces, suddenly had an entire swath of their market that they couldn't put on the shelf or they couldn't sell to distributors. Those distributors had stock that they couldn't, it had inventory that they could no longer sell. And those gun stores that had pistols that had braces on them had to either modify the firearm or not really sell the product. And so holding on any form of inventory is bad for a store. And what resulted from that was a heavy-handed economic attack or an economic weakness. How do you call this? Suddenly, the firearms industry, which already exists in kind of a wave pattern where you've got some year, like especially election years, we expect sales to rise, and then in between that, they kind of go down. This ebb and flow of the firearms industry. In the year where the firearms industry was already in an ebb, suddenly a great amount of their inventory was no longer capable of being sold until, as we have inevitably understood, the Supreme Court or the courts would start overturning it. But that was a matter of time. It had to work its way through the courts, and this is a strategy that we've seen the Biden administration use multiple times. Instigate an event, create a reaction, and then just wait for the courts to overturn it, and then maybe do it again. So we're going to forgive student loans. And then the Supreme Court says you can't do that. And he goes, okay, well, we're going to forgive student loans because it's going to take you 3 weeks to tell us that we can't do it. But in those 3 weeks, we can at least market on it, and we can at least maybe get some of it out or something like that. So I think that the Brace ruling wasn't really primarily intended to address crime, but to economically cripple the types of people and businesses around things like the AR-15, which are continually identified as the firearm of the right or whatever. An AR-15, if you were to ask the average citizen in the United States about which person is more likely to buy an AR-15, a Harris voter or a Trump voter or a left-wing person or a right-wing person, they're going to naturally say the person on the right. But if you show a handgun, they might be a little bit more ambiguous on it. At least we could look at what that statistic could do. So the intent then was to address, and I believe that the intent of the Brace ruling was to financially damage and demoralize firearms ownership and the gun culture in the United States. intermission over. So we talked about some of the issues with the statement by the White House. Again, we have this introduction along with an accusation, which is creating a sense of urgency. The introduction is that the Biden-Harris administration is now enacting and using this newfound problem or new emerging issue as justification for enacting more of their agenda. The motivation behind the urgency is to claim that Trump is responsible for violence and that the Biden-Harris has a track record, or Biden-Harris administration has a track record of curbing said violence. Only it was really them doing they're doing the violence themselves and then blaming somebody else for doing it. But I digress. So we have the two emerging threats are machine gun conversion devices and two unserialized 3D printed firearms. We could go down the road of what the suggested solutions are to these, but this is where I'm going to deviate. If you read the statement, you will see that the arguments being made about what the problem is very, very different than the solutions. It could be as simple as there's a problem over here, and I'm going to do what I always wanted to do anyway to justify it. It's like saying that you want to buy a muscle car, and then in order to justify the purchase of that muscle car, instead of just saying I want to own a Shelby GT or whatever you're talking about, instead of just saying you want to own a small 9mm handgun with a suppressor, you have to create some sort of story to justify ownership. Instead of just saying I want to own this SIG P365 with a CCX can by JK Armament, which I will have to be putting out a review on it soon. Instead of just saying, I want one of these, I think it's going to be useful for my scenario, I actually have to create some sort of elaborate idea as to why. Well, there's a potential that someone breaks into my house at night and I don't want to worry, I don't want to be concerned about my hearing, even while simultaneously knowing that my grandfather spent both World War II and Korea with loud guns and no hearing protection, given he was mostly deaf before he passed. But the issue being said is that I'm creating a story over here to justify something that I already wanted to do. I already wanted to buy the gun, or I already wanted one of these, and so I had to create some sort of justification. The Biden-Harris administration already wanted to implement these actions, and they're just identifying some sort of justification post hoc. Or not even post haste. And that's why we're looking at things like safe storage of firearms, Medicaid reimbursement for counseling, which I think should just immediately be investigated for money laundering, and the implementation of our state red flag laws, not red state flag laws, state red flag laws. The first one, encouraging the safe storage of firearms, sounds ambiguous, but since we know it's also coming from the same mouth of the same person who said that we can enter your home and confirm that you are storing it safely, not only is the idea suspect, it's now a backdoor into your privacy. The second one, Medicaid reimbursement for counseling, and anywhere where I think Medicaid is involved in this document should be understood as justification justification itself for a potential money laundering situation. We are going to pay our friends to tell your kids not to own guns. How much are you going to pay them? $3 billion. Or 45 million or 130 million or whatever it is. The government is going to pay, the administration is going to pay their friends money to do certain things. Maybe we want to look at that as some form of laundering or the mismanagement of government funds. Continuing on from there, we have the final kind of nail in the coffin, which is implementing our state red flag laws. And this is where we get to the point. Property, the ability to own a firearm is nice. It's valuable. It's good for, it is oftentimes described as the antidote or the prevention itself of tyranny. However, if you look at the way that insurgency functions, if you look at the way that wars are fought, if you look at the way that or tyranny is sort of implemented step by step or even in a quick evolution, it's not really the items that are the prevention of them, but it's the privacy of the individual. It's the abstract concept of an individual's privacy that is invaded. And once that is invaded and overturned or overruled or destroyed or crushed or eradicated, then you have the tyranny. Not only is the act of invading a sovereign citizen, and I don't mean the sovereign citizens with the weird driver's license kind of goofy garbage, but an individual, not only is the invasion of a person's privacy the initiation of a form of tyranny, but it itself could be considered tyranny in its own action. If we wanted to get into the root of what we understand as tyranny, we might say something like an imbalance of power, where a single individual, a despot, has so much power in his control that he can wield it maliciously against his own citizens. But we also might look at tyranny as a sort of mindset, a worldview that an individual will have. If we were going to take it on that second round, then tyranny is the belief that other people do not have the right to their own privacy, but you rather see those people themselves as property. If we were to take this definition and start with the beginning of how Kamala Harris approached the subject of gun control, that you can own your firearm, but we can enter your home and confirm that you are following our rules with it, she does not believe, or if we're going to put that under the paradigm or the lens of this as a worldview, she does not believe that her citizens are anything more than subjects. You are a slave to Kamala Harris in her mind. The gun owner, the person who can resist her will, is not just a citizen who does not agree with her, but rather a threat to her self-sovereignty, her sovereignty as something above that of the state or you or the citizenry. She does not view herself as a servant of the American people, according to this statement, but rather as something much more nefarious. But if we were to let her go, if we were to push Kamala Harris off to the side and start looking at what this problem means for the population, we could start looking at this idea that privacy is itself just as important as property. To the gun culture, it is not good enough that you own an AR-15 or you are trained in it or you have some practice in it, but there's also a sense of community which requires that the government does not have any sort of invasion of said privacy. As soon as your privacy is invaded, as soon as there is a registry where you must tell the state what you own, where you own it, and where you store it, as soon as the state is capable of, without evidence of a crime, investigating your home for a potential poor storage, is so long as you are dealing with the victimless crime of firearms ownership, then you have entered into tyranny, and the way that it is manifested and manipulated further on will be the continual punishment of the individual. One of the best ways to crush any form of liberty in a population is to require them to ask for permission to merely live. I know that sounds a little dramatic, but let me condense it into a final closing statement. In the beginning, we talked about how there is this doublespeak going on, that we are aware of a problem, say inner city gang kids getting Glocks with the switch and using that to carjack vehicles and cause violent crime and hold up gas stations and do all this kind of issue. As a result, we have a gun problem in America. So what we're going to do is we're going to find all the people that are actually our political opponents and blame them for that. We're going to create a problem, and the punishment of you is the solution. We are going to burn down a city and blame our political opponents for that action. This is then going to be used as a justification for an individual not having a right to privacy. Because of this, because of the idea built into private property, the individual of the American citizen has a right not only to the ownership of their firearm, but a distinct prohibition that the government can create some sort of surveillance about it. The fact that I own a gun and that the government doesn't know which guns I own, how many I own, or where I store them is integral to the freedom of the citizens in the United States. So long as we start chipping away or we eradicate the intellectual side of this argument, the Second Amendment will mean nothing. If the American people do not believe that they have a right to privacy and that any infringement of it, whether it is a registry, whether it is safe storage laws, or whether it is a red flag law, if they come to believe those things to be morally acceptable, then the Second Amendment will fall within a generation. Tyranny, communism, and the evils that follow through with that do not view the citizen as a citizen, but as a subject to be subjugated. So, as we're going forward, as we're addressing these moral issues within the gun culture of America, please pay attention, please follow along, and if you have comments below on where you're seeing this implemented, I would look forward to it. Don't Fed post, and if there is a certain piece of kit that you want reviewed, let me know, and let me know in the comments below, and I'll get started. But this has been the Redacted Culture Cast on how privacy is just as important as property. Thank you for listening. And if you want to support us, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com or go over to redactedllc.com and jump in on the, well, how do you call it? Merch train? Yeah, that sounds weird. You can pick up some of our shop to keep the lights on and keep this show rolling. Again, check out Obsidian Arms and thank them for their support. And we will see you soon. Now go forth and conquer.